The story of the F-14 Tomcat begins not with glory, not with aircraft carriers cutting through the ocean, and not with Hollywood. It begins with anxiety. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the United States Navy faced a growing strategic nightmare. The Cold War had entered a new phase, and the world's oceans, once buffers of distance, were becoming front lines. The Soviet Union was investing heavily in long-range bombers and anti-ship missiles designed for one specific purpose: to destroy American aircraft carriers before they could launch their aircraft. For the U.S. Navy, the aircraft carrier was more than a ship. It was the centerpiece of American power projection. If carriers could be neutralized, the United States would lose its ability to fight far from home. Protecting them was not optional. It was existential. At the same time, naval aviation was struggling with the consequences of earlier decisions. The Navy's previous attempt to build a next-generation fleet defense fighter had collapsed in spectacular fashion. The F-111B program, intended to provide long-range interception from carriers, became a symbol of everything that could go wrong in military procurement. The aircraft was too heavy, too complex, and fundamentally unsuited for carrier operations. After years of cost overruns and political battles, the program was canceled. The cancellation left the Navy exposed. By the mid-1960s, Soviet Tu-95 and Tu-22 bombers were capable of launching anti-ship missiles from hundreds of miles away. These bombers did not need to dogfight. They only needed to get close enough to fire. Existing Navy fighters lacked the range, radar power, and missile capability to stop them reliably. The Navy needed something radically different. Not a dogfighter, not a lightweight interceptor, but a fleet defense fighter, an aircraft designed to see far, shoot far, and kill threats before they ever reached carrier strike groups. This requirement would shape every aspect of what became the F-14. The Navy's vision was clear, but controversial. The new aircraft would need a powerful radar capable of tracking multiple targets at extreme ranges. It would need long-range missiles that could engage bombers before they launched their weapons. It would need endurance, speed, and the ability to operate in the brutal environment of carrier decks. And it would need to do all of this while remaining controllable at low speeds during carrier landings. Meeting these requirements meant compromise and innovation. One of the most radical decisions was the adoption of variable geometry wings. Swept back at high speed for efficiency and extended forward at low speed for control, these swing wings allowed the aircraft to operate across an enormous flight envelope. It was a complex solution, but the Navy believed the mission justified the risk. Equally revolutionary was the decision to design the aircraft around a two-person crew. The pilot would fly the aircraft, while a radar intercept officer, or RIO, would manage sensors, radar, and weapons. This division of labor acknowledged a hard truth. Modern air combat was becoming too complex for a single human to manage alone. At the heart of the aircraft would be a radar unlike anything previously fielded on a fighter. The AWG-9 radar was designed to track multiple targets simultaneously at unprecedented distances. Paired with the AIM-54 Phoenix missile, the system promised something extraordinary: the ability to engage 6 targets at once, hundreds of miles away. For the first time, a fighter aircraft was being designed as a system, not just a machine. The competition to build this aircraft reflected the urgency of the requirement. Grumman, a company with deep experience in naval aviation, emerged as the prime contractor. The company understood carrier operations in a way few others did. Its engineers approached the problem with a focus on survivability, maintainability, and operational reality. Lessons learned from decades at sea. When the F-14 prototype first took to the air in 1970, it looked unlike any fighter before it. Large, aggressive, and unmistakably naval, it carried itself with a sense of purpose rather than elegance. This was not an aircraft designed to win air shows. It was designed to protect ships and the people aboard them. Early development was not smooth. Engines proved unreliable. Weight and cost became constant concerns. Critics questioned whether the Navy was building an overly complex aircraft at a time when budgets were tightening and public confidence in military programs was low after Vietnam. Yet the Navy pressed forward. They understood something fundamental. The F-14 was not just another fighter. It was the shield behind which American power at sea would survive. Without it, carriers would be vulnerable. With it, they would remain dominant. In 1974, the F-14 Tomcat officially entered service. Almost immediately, it began to change the way naval aviation thought about air combat. Its presence extended the defensive perimeter of carrier groups by hundreds of miles. Enemy bombers could no longer approach undetected. The balance of power at sea shifted, quietly but decisively. What no one could yet foresee was that this aircraft, born from fear and strategic necessity, would become something far greater than a fleet defender. Would become a symbol, a political tool, a cultural icon, and eventually, a myth. But that myth would be forged not in movies, but in the unforgiving realities of Cold War patrols, real combat, and global politics. That story was only beginning. By the time the F-14 Tomcat entered operational service in the mid-1970s, the United States Navy faced a strategic problem that went far beyond dogfighting. The Cold War was increasingly shifting toward the oceans, where aircraft carriers represented both unmatched power and immense vulnerability. A carrier battle group could project force anywhere in the world, but it also presented a concentrated target for long-range Soviet bombers armed with anti-ship missiles. The Soviet Union had developed a doctrine designed specifically to destroy American carriers. Long-range bombers, such as the Tu-95 and Tu-22 variants, were expected to launch massive salvos of cruise missiles from hundreds of miles away. These missiles, flying at high speed and low altitude, posed a serious threat. If even a few reached their targets, the consequences could be catastrophic. The U.S. Navy understood that defending the fleet required a new kind of fighter. Traditional interceptors lacked the range, sensors, and coordination needed to stop attacks before missiles were launched. The solution had to be layered: detect the enemy far away, engage bombers at long range, and destroy threats before they reached firing distance. This was the environment in which the F-14 Tomcat was meant to operate. Unlike earlier naval fighters, the Tomcat was designed as part of an integrated system. Its radar, the powerful AWG-9, could track multiple targets at extreme ranges. Its primary weapon, the AIM-54 Phoenix missile, was equally revolutionary. Capable of engaging targets more than 100 miles away, the Phoenix gave the Navy something it had never possessed before: true long-range fleet air defense. In theory, a pair of F-14s could intercept an entire formation of enemy bombers long before they posed a direct threat. In practice, this capability reshaped how naval air warfare was imagined. The Tomcat was no longer just a fighter, it was a shield. Operating the F-14, however, was anything but simple. The aircraft was large, complex, and demanding. Its variable sweep wings allowed it to perform well at both low speeds during carrier operations and high speeds during intercepts. But this flexibility came at the cost of mechanical complexity. Maintenance crews worked constantly to keep the aircraft mission-ready. Pilots and radar intercept officers trained extensively to master the coordination required to exploit the Tomcat's full potential. This two-person crew concept was central to the F-14's identity. The pilot focused on flying the aircraft under challenging conditions, often at night or in poor weather. Behind him, the radar intercept officer managed sensors, targets, and weapons. In a fleet defense scenario, the RIO's role was critical. He interpreted radar data, coordinated engagements, and ensured that missiles were launched at precisely the right moment. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, F-14 squadrons became the frontline guardians of American carrier groups. They flew endless patrols over open ocean, practicing intercepts against simulated threats. These missions were rarely glamorous, but they were essential. The Tomcat's value lay not in how often it fired missiles, but in how effectively it deterred attacks from ever being launched. At the same time, the aircraft began to develop a reputation that extended beyond strategy. Its sheer presence was imposing. With its wide stance, swept wings, and twin tails, the F-14 looked powerful in a way few aircraft did. On the deck of an aircraft carrier, it dominated the visual landscape. For many sailors and aviators, the Tomcat became a symbol of American naval air power at its peak. Despite this prestige, the F-14 was not without problems. The aircraft was expensive to operate. Its engines, particularly in early variants, were maintenance-intensive and sensitive to handling. Fuel consumption was high. Sortie generation rates were lower than for smaller, simpler fighters. Within the Navy, debates emerged about whether such a specialized and costly platform could be sustained indefinitely. Yet these concerns were often outweighed by the strategic reality of the Cold War. As long as the Soviet bomber threat existed, the F-14's unique capabilities were considered indispensable. No other aircraft in the Navy's inventory could replicate its combination of range, radar power, and missile reach. The Tomcat's role during this period was largely invisible to the public. It did not fight dramatic battles or score large numbers of kills. Instead, it enforced a balance. Soviet planners had to account for the fact that their bombers might never reach launch range. This uncertainty complicated their strategies and strengthened American deterrence at sea. Ironically, the very success of this mission meant that the F-14's combat record remained limited during the Cold War. The aircraft was doing exactly what it was designed to do: prevent war rather than fight it. For the men who flew it, this was both a point of pride and a source of frustration. They trained relentlessly for a conflict that everyone hoped would never happen. By the late 1980s, the world began to change once again. The Cold War started to fade, and with it, the primary threat that had justified the F-14's original mission. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the massive bomber raids envisioned by planners never materialized. For the Tomcat, this shift marked the beginning of a new chapter. An aircraft designed to defend against nuclear-armed bombers would soon be asked to fight very different wars, against smaller adversaries, in regional conflicts, far from the open ocean. To survive, the F-14 would have to evolve beyond its original purpose. That evolution, from fleet defender to combat workhorse, would define the next phase of the Tomcat's myth. By the early 1980s, the F-14 Tomcat had firmly established itself as the centerpiece of U.S. Navy air defense. Carrier battle groups depended on it as their primary shield against long-range threats. The aircraft's combination of radar reach, missile power, and endurance made it uniquely suited to the strategic realities of the Cold War. Yet despite its advanced design, the Tomcat had not yet faced the ultimate test: real combat against a determined enemy. That test arrived sooner than expected. In August 1981, tensions between the United States and Libya escalated over disputed airspace in the Gulf of Sidra. Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi claimed the Gulf as territorial waters, a claim the U.S. rejected. American carrier groups entered the area to challenge the assertion, and Libyan aircraft were sent to intercept them. The encounter that followed would mark the first combat victory of the F-14. Two Libyan Su-22 fighters engaged U.S. Navy Tomcats from the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz. When one of the Su-22s fired a missile, the engagement crossed the threshold from confrontation to combat. The F-14s responded immediately, downing both Libyan aircraft. The encounter was brief, decisive, and symbolic. It demonstrated that the Tomcat was not only a theoretical deterrent, but a lethal combat aircraft capable of dominating the skies. Throughout the 1980s, the F-14 continued to serve primarily as a fleet defender, intercepting Soviet aircraft and shadowing bombers during tense Cold War patrols. These missions rarely made headlines, but they were critical. Each interception reinforced the credibility of American naval power. Each radar contact, each visual identification, reminded adversaries that U.S. carriers were not isolated targets, but heavily defended moving fortresses. At the same time, the Tomcat's complexity became increasingly apparent. The aircraft was expensive to maintain, labor-intensive, and demanding on crews. Its variable sweep wings, powerful engines, and advanced avionics required constant attention. Critics within the Navy and the Department of Defense began to question whether such a sophisticated interceptor was sustainable in the long term. Then came the end of the Cold War. The collapse of the Soviet Union fundamentally altered the strategic environment the F-14 had been designed for. The massive bomber raids it was built to counter never materialized. Budgets tightened. The Navy faced pressure to justify every platform in its inventory. For the Tomcat, this raised an existential question. Could a Cold War interceptor adapt to a new era of warfare? The answer emerged in the early 1990s. During Operation Desert Storm in 1991, the F-14 was deployed to the Persian Gulf. While it did not score air-to-air victories during the conflict, its role expanded in unexpected ways. The Tomcat's long range and endurance made it ideal for combat air patrols over vast areas. More importantly, it began to take on reconnaissance and strike coordination missions, marking the beginning of its transformation. The Navy recognized that the F-14 could no longer survive as a single-mission aircraft. To remain relevant, it had to evolve. This led to a series of upgrades that fundamentally changed the Tomcat's identity. Precision-guided munitions were integrated. New targeting pods allowed it to designate and strike ground targets with accuracy previously unimaginable for a fleet interceptor. This evolution culminated in the F-14D and the so-called Bombcat configuration. Once designed to hunt bombers at extreme range, the Tomcat now carried laser-guided bombs into combat. It supported troops on the ground, struck strategic targets, and provided persistent presence over hostile territory. Few aircraft in history have undergone such a dramatic transformation while retaining their core design. Operations in the Balkans during the 1990s further solidified this new role. F-14s flew missions over Bosnia and Kosovo, enforcing no-fly zones and conducting strike operations. These were complex, politically sensitive environments that demanded precision and restraint. The Tomcat proved capable of both. Yet even as the aircraft demonstrated its adaptability, the forces working against it continued to grow. Newer platforms promised similar capabilities at lower cost and with fewer maintenance demands. The Navy began to look toward a future centered on multi-role fighters that could replace several aircraft types at once. Ironically, it was during this period of uncertainty that the F-14's cultural legacy exploded. In 1986, the release of Top Gun transformed the Tomcat into an icon. The film did more than entertain. It embedded the F-14 into American popular culture. The aircraft became a symbol of speed, power, and confidence. Recruitment surged. The Tomcat was no longer just a naval asset. It was a myth. This dual identity defined the F-14 by the end of the 1990s. Operationally, it was a highly capable but increasingly expensive aircraft, fighting for relevance in a changing military landscape. Culturally, it was untouchable, a legend etched into the American imagination. As the new millennium approached, the Tomcat stood at a crossroads. It had proven itself in combat. It had adapted beyond its original mission. It had become one of the most recognizable fighters in history. And yet, its future was far from secure. The next chapter of the F-14's story would not be defined by enemies in the sky, but by decisions made in conference rooms and budget offices. Decisions that would ultimately determine whether the legend could survive reality. By the early 1990s, the world that had created the F-14 Tomcat no longer existed. The Soviet Union collapsed, the Cold War ended, and the apocalyptic naval battles the Tomcat had been built to fight never came. For the US Navy, this moment triggered a fundamental reassessment of priorities and placed the F-14 in an increasingly uncertain position. The Tomcat had been designed as a fleet defender first and foremost. Its mission was to intercept Soviet bombers before they could launch anti-ship missiles. But with that threat gone, the Navy faced a difficult question. What role did a large, expensive, air-to-air focused fighter play in a new era defined by regional conflicts and power projection ashore? The answer was adaptation, but adaptation under pressure. During the 1990s, US naval aviation shifted toward expeditionary warfare. Carrier air wings were now expected to strike targets deep inland, support ground forces, and operate in complex regional conflicts rather than prepare for a single catastrophic naval battle. Aircraft that could not contribute meaningfully to strike missions risked becoming irrelevant. The F-14, despite its legendary air combat capabilities, initially struggled in this new environment. For much of its early service life, the Tomcat had lacked a true precision strike capability. It could carry bombs, but it was not optimized for ground attack. Compared to newer multi-role aircraft, it appeared specialized, heavy, and costly to maintain. Critics inside the Navy and Pentagon began to question whether the Tomcat was a relic of a bygone strategic mindset. Yet once again, the aircraft refused to disappear. Rather than retiring the F-14, the Navy chose to reinvent it. Beginning in the early 1990s, the Tomcat underwent a series of upgrades that fundamentally transformed its role. The most significant change was the integration of the Lantern targeting pod, which allowed F-14 crews to conduct precision-guided strike missions for the first time. This upgrade changed everything. With Lantern, the F-14 evolved from a pure interceptor into a true multi-role strike fighter. Its two-seat cockpit proved ideal for this mission. While the pilot focused on flying and situational awareness, the radar intercept officer took on the role of managing targeting, sensors, and weapons delivery. This division of labor made the Tomcat exceptionally effective in complex strike environments. The reborn aircraft earned a new nickname, the Bombcat. The Bombcat made its combat debut during operations in the Balkans in the mid-1990s. Flying from carriers in the Adriatic Sea, F-14s conducted strike missions over Bosnia and later Kosovo. These operations demonstrated that the Tomcat could adapt to modern warfare, delivering precision munitions while retaining its formidable air-to-air capabilities. The transformation continued into the 21st century. Following the attacks of September 11, 2001, the United States entered a new kind of war. In Afghanistan, naval aviation played a central role in providing air power over a landlocked country far from the sea. Carrier-based aircraft flew long missions, often lasting many hours, to support ground forces. The F-14 proved unexpectedly well-suited to this role. Its large airframe allowed it to carry significant fuel and weapons. Its endurance made it valuable for long loiter times over the battlefield. Its two-person crew excelled at coordinating with ground controllers and managing complex strike scenarios. In many cases, Tomcats remained on station longer than newer aircraft, providing persistent support to troops on the ground. The aircraft that had been designed to defend carrier groups from Soviet bombers was now dropping precision-guided bombs in support of soldiers fighting insurgents. This irony was not lost on those who flew it. During the early years of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, F-14s flew thousands of strike missions. They delivered JDAMs, laser-guided bombs, and provided close air support in some of the most demanding conditions imaginable. The Tomcat's performance earned respect from ground forces and reaffirmed its value to naval aviation. Yet even as it proved itself once again in combat, the F-14's fate was increasingly sealed. Maintenance remained a constant challenge. The aircraft was complex, labor-intensive, and expensive to keep flying. Spare parts were difficult to source, especially as concerns grew about preventing technology leakage to Iran, the only other country to operate the F-14. Each flight hour required significant manpower and cost compared to newer platforms. At the same time, the Navy had already chosen its future. The F/A-18EF Super Hornet represented a different philosophy. It was smaller, cheaper to operate, easier to maintain, and fully multi-role from the start. While it lacked the Tomcat's raw performance and long-range interception capability, it aligned better with post-Cold War realities and budget constraints. This decision was not a judgment on the F-14's effectiveness. It was a reflection of changing priorities. By the mid-2000s, the Tomcat's days were numbered. Retirement plans moved forward despite resistance from pilots, maintainers, and fans. The Navy argued that resources were better spent on platforms designed specifically for modern warfare, rather than sustaining a complex legacy aircraft. In 2006, the U.S. Navy officially retired the F-14 Tomcat from frontline service. The final carrier landing was emotional. For those who had flown and maintained the aircraft, it marked the end of an era. The Tomcat had been more than a fighter. It had been a symbol of naval aviation dominance, a machine that embodied power, reach, and presence. And yet, retirement did not diminish the Tomcat's myth. If anything, it amplified it. The F-14 had not faded away quietly. It had fought in multiple wars, adapted to roles it was never designed for, and remained relevant long after many believed it obsolete. It left service not because it failed, but because the world around it had changed. The question now was no longer what the F-14 had been, but why it continued to loom so large in American memory. That answer lies in the final chapter of the Tomcat story. By the early 2000s, the era that had shaped the F-14 Tomcat was coming to an end. The Cold War was long over. The Soviet bomber threat had disappeared, and the U.S. Navy faced a fundamentally different strategic environment. Instead of preparing for massive fleet battles against a peer adversary, naval aviation was increasingly focused on regional conflicts, expeditionary warfare, and precision strike operations. In this new reality, the Tomcat found itself in a difficult position. Despite its unmatched air-to-air legacy, the F-14 was expensive to operate and maintain. Its variable geometry wings, complex radar, and aging systems required enormous logistical effort. As newer aircraft entered service, the Navy began to question whether it still made sense to sustain a fighter designed for a threat that no longer existed. The arrival of the F/A-18 Super Hornet accelerated this debate. While less dramatic and less specialized than the Tomcat, the Super Hornet offered something the Navy increasingly valued: versatility, lower operating costs, and easier integration into modern networked warfare. It could perform air defense, strike, reconnaissance, and support missions within a single platform. For many inside the Navy, the decision was pragmatic. For many pilots and aviation enthusiasts, it felt like sacrilege. The retirement process began gradually. Squadrons transitioned to newer aircraft, and the Tomcat's presence on carrier decks became less common. In 2006, the U.S. Navy officially retired the F-14 from active service. The final carrier landing marked the end of an era that had lasted more than 3 decades. Yet the Tomcat did not simply fade away. Its reputation continued to grow long after its last operational flight. Veterans spoke of it with reverence, Naval aviators described it as unforgiving but unmatched, an aircraft that demanded excellence and rewarded mastery. Engineers remembered it as a machine that pushed the limits of what carrier aviation could achieve. Popular culture played a decisive role in transforming the F-14 from a respected fighter into a true myth. Films, documentaries, and books immortalized its silhouette and sound. To the American public, the Tomcat became inseparable from the image of the U.S. Navy at its peak: fast, powerful, and confident. At the same time, the aircraft found a second life beyond American service. Iran, which had acquired F-14s before the 1979 revolution, continued to operate a limited number of Tomcats, using domestically supported maintenance and parts. This unusual afterlife only added to the aircraft's mystique, reinforcing its reputation as a machine that refused to disappear. By 2025, the F-14 Tomcat occupies a unique place in aviation history. It is no longer judged purely by technical specifications or mission profiles. Instead, it is remembered as the embodiment of a specific moment in time, when air superiority was measured in miles, when pilots hunted bombers at the edge of radar range, and when carrier fighters were built not to multitask, but to dominate a single mission absolutely. The Tomcat's legacy is not defined by how long it served, but by how decisively it shaped naval aviation doctrine. It forced adversaries to rethink bomber operations. It redefined fleet air defense. It proved that long-range interception from a carrier was not only possible, but reliable. Most importantly, it demonstrated the power of specialization. The F-14 was not efficient. It was not cheap. It was not flexible by modern standards. But in its intended role, it was unmatched. That clarity of purpose is rare in modern weapons systems and deeply admired. In a world increasingly dominated by multi-role platforms and software-defined warfare, the Tomcat stands as a reminder of a different philosophy. A philosophy where an aircraft was built to solve one problem better than anything else in existence, and succeeded. That is why the F-14 Tomcat did not simply retire. It transcended. It became a reference point, a benchmark, a myth, and long after its engines fell silent on American carrier decks, its shadow continues to fly across history, memory, and the identity of U.S. naval aviation itself.